Okay, greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logging in from. Welcome. This is Middle East Critique Ramadan course on Palestine and Imperialism. My name is Isam Abdul Bubakar Al-Kurafli, Assistant Editor of Middle East Critique, an academic journal focusing on Western Asia and Northern Africa. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this course on imperialism? So as a journal, we decided to launch this open pedagogical initiative called the Ramadan Course on Palestine and Imperialism. And I'll be very brief, but please let me explain to you the two main reasons why we decided to launch this initiative before listening to our esteemed speakers. First, the course has been put together and launched in support of the people of Palestine and their call for a global wave of action during Ramadan and after, where people from all spheres of life dedicate their time and abilities to end the ongoing genocide in Gaza, Palestine. As academics, scholars, and activists, and so forth, we decided that our abilities could be put at the service of this global wave of action by organizing an open educational platform that is accessible to the general public, even more so in light of the silence and censoring of numerous academics within public and private educational institutions across the whole globe that have been trying to speak logically on these issues, namely Palestine and imperialism and the ongoing genocide. Second, the course doesn't simply focus on Palestine, but it purposely aims to connect the Palestinian question with the question of imperialism. There have been several teach-ins being organized and educational initiatives being pursued in the face of this ongoing genocide. And there are thousands of books being written on Palestine. Yet, while they all provide useful insights on Palestinian society, most of them tend to dilute and water down the role that the US-led imperialism has played and continues to play in the region, and did so for many decades, and how this is tied to the question of national liberation in Palestine as well. And as you will see in this session and the upcoming sessions, we will have sessions that focus on Palestine, national liberation, and imperialism as an internationalist issue. In doing so, we invited scholars from various fields to explain the enduring relevance and intellectual necessity of picking up the philosophical tradition anchored in historical materialism to revisit the unprecedented events that we are witnessing today. So in doing so, we'll be touching on various topics, as you can see in the program that I'll share with you shortly in the chat. With me today, as you can see, there are a couple of people. There's Karina and Walaa and Rabab, but Karina will kind of co-facilitate the session and she will introduce our speakers. But if you have attended week 2 session, which also you can view it on our YouTube channel, Karina, or Dr. Karina Mullen, teaches in the Department of Political Science and Economics at John Jay College and Brooklyn College. Her research examines the historical legacies of colonialism, the role of capitalist expansion, and imperialist implications in shaping global South security states. She is currently working on a monograph for Brill titled Race, Class, Empire, and the Remaking of the Tunisian Security State. I also highly encourage you to check out the work of Karina, where she has multiple media presences and so forth. So without further ado, please, Karina, the floor is yours to introduce our esteemed speakers.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Isam, for that introduction. And thank you to you and Matteo and Middle East Critique for organizing this really crucial set of teach-ins. I just wanted to say a few words before introducing our amazing panelists. A few words about the ongoing genocide in Palestine, just to ground our discussion today. And I'm sure everyone joining us here are all aware of the grim milestone that we've recently passed of 6 months into this barbaric imperialist Zionist assault on the people and the Palestinian people of Gaza. And it must, in what I think must be pointed out, has been the failed attempt to destroy the resistance, ethnically cleanse Gaza, and pacify the Palestinian people, as part of the project of the over 100 years of settler colonial accumulation through dispossession in Palestine. Despite its failure to achieve its objectives, the humanitarian cost of the Zionist imperialist assault have been horrific. Over 33,100 Palestinians have been killed, more than 40,000 if we include the people missing under the rubble, and that includes 14,000 children. Nearly 76,000 people have been injured. About 1.7 million people have been displaced. Famine is spreading. 80% of all homes and houses have been destroyed, partially or completely. More than 405 schools and universities have been destroyed. It's been a systematic targeting of higher education, and every single university has been destroyed. 33 hospitals out of 36 have been completely destroyed. The extent of death and destruction is really beyond words. And as with past imperialist wars, this one too has been provided discursive cover by colonial imperialist feminists who have gladly taken up their historical role in manufacturing consent for genocide. Throughout its duration, the Zionist settler colonial project has mobilized gender in various ways to enable land expropriation, exploitation of natural resources and labor, and other forms of wealth drain from the Palestinian people. Palestinian women have been at the forefront of the national liberation struggle, and so the use of particularly gendered forms of violence, including sexual violence, incarceration, and torture, as well as the denial of reproductive care, have all been central to Zionist imperialist counter-revolution and the repression of resistance. Since October 7th, there has been a resurgence of liberal, Orientalist, and colonial feminist tropes by Zionist propagandists, attempting to dehumanize the Palestinian people and to falsely portray the Palestinian resistance as somehow unprincipled. And this is part of course, the ideological war on Palestine, which is linked, of course, and underpinning the material war and genocide. I can't think of two more amazing scholar activists to take on these narratives and to discuss Palestinian liberation as a feminist issue and to tell us why Zionism, colonialism, and imperialism are fundamentally incompatible with feminism. So without further ado, I'm going to now introduce our speakers. So we will be beginning with Dr. Walaa Alqaisiya, who is a Marie Curie Fellow at Ca' Foscari University of Venice, Italy, and Columbia University. She has a PhD in human geography from Durham University and has worked as a teaching fellow in the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics. Dr. Alqaisiya's work draws on an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist feminist approach to highlight the deeply gendered, racialized, and ecocidal nature of Zionist settler colonialism and US-led imperialism. And I know that Essam has shared, will be sharing some links from Dr. Alqaisiya's amazing work in the chat. So please have a look as well. And we'll begin with Dr. Alqaisiya, and afterwards I'll introduce Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Corina, so much for this introduction, and thank you, Essam, as well. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, it's 9 o'clock Palestine time. We are marking the end of Ramadan now, and people, I guess, will be celebrating Eid. Celebration is not so much the word for Palestinians as the genocide continues in Gaza. So let it be the Eid to end the genocide. Okay, my presentation for today is going to be somewhat boring. I'm going to be sharing some reflections from a paper that I'm currently working on, but I hope that the slides will make up for it. So I'll go ahead and share screen. Let me know if you can see.
We can see
everything. Okay, great. Fantastic. Okay. So the title of my presentation is The Urgency of Anti-Imperial Feminism, Lessons from Palestine. The recent escalation of Zionist and US-led genocidal war in Gaza unveils the functionality of gender to the ontoepistemic foundations of settler colonialism and imperialism. At its premise, Western modernity draws a boundary between human versus non-human, which marks the gendering processes informing settler colonial formations under US-led imperialism. The work of decolonial scholars such as Maria Legonis and Sylvia Winter charts the history of colonial and imperial violence through which gender emerges to incarnate the ideological and material cognates of Euro-centered global capitalism. In providing a historicization of the colonial modern gender system in the context of the Americas and the Caribbean, Legonis and Winter locate an analysis of gender in its inherent correlation with the racializing logics undergirding the genre of the bourgeois man, as they call it. Their work crucially unveils the capitalist and colonial foundations instructing the politics of recognition, including for the to-be emancipated women of the colonies, whose material and historical proximity to their affiliate men reify the onto-epistemic violence of colonial modernity. Looking at the events that have been unfolding before our eyes since the Zionist entity began its brutal onslaught on the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, we see yet again how gender, as I have argued in my work, is a marker used to draw the contours of settler colonial encroachment. In a nutshell, gender as the property of capital manifests in how settlers come to literally occupy the gendered sexed subjectivities that bestow them the right to plant their LGBT flags on scorched Palestinian indigenous land. Their backers in the imperial core mobilize the plight of protecting our women and girls from the perverse monstrosities of the Muslim terrorist. The plight of subjects marked by their gendered vulnerability, that is the women and girls, enfolds the plight of humanity. Hence, we see the kind of messages declared by the likes of Sheryl Sandberg's followers of the Hillary Clinton feminist and personality cult, where humanity is rendered at stake, and its restoration is the task of those who have been endowed the benevolence to act on humanity's behalf. Such discourse on humanity relies on, as well as advances, a conception of the human that is animated by the moral value system in material and moral sense of the white man. The defining principle of this moral system is the distinction it sets between the human and non-human, or human animal in gallant words, as well as within the new definitions of nature in its domesticated, humanely elevated sense, that is the garden versus the jungle in Borrell's discourse. Both the animal and the jungle capture the racialized projections of self and other construed in the very process of humanization. That is, the Native American, the African, and the Arab are in need to be humanized, become man, in other words, through colonialism's civilizing mission. In The Birth of the Jungle, Michael Lundbold provides cultural analysis on what he calls the discourse of the jungle, revealing how racialization of animality imbricates classed, gendered, and sexualized processes in the US at the turn of the 20th century. Examining the text Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs, published in 1914, Lundbold shows that bourgeois white men are constructed as innately able to restrain their animality with reason and rationality. Situating analysis on the discourse of the humane in relation to animals within the context of widespread lynching of Black Americans, Lundbold reveals how animality is essentially elevated over Blackness, unquote. And he continues, such animality or such view of Blackness enables white men to torture and vivisect Black men, thus treating them worse than animals at the turn of the century, unquote. Now, a Darwinist, a Freudian conception of the savage underlines the rewriting of Blackness in relation to the wildness of the African, conceiving them as innately amoral and savage, as opposed to white men who can take a stroll on the wild side, yet maintain their quote unquote inherent instinct for chivalry. The Darwinist and Freudian analytical combo seems to suggest that savagery of the Black African in the jungle manifests in two main and interrelated aspects. First, their delight in cannibalism, the torture and killing in the most hysteric manner. And second, the delight that they have in the rape of white women, which derives from the essentially instinctual nature of savages and the resulting inability, supposedly, to repress their sexual instincts. The mobilization of a taxonomy analogous to the discourse of the jungle has been at the core of Zionist genocidal campaign. Zionists and their backers in the Western imperial core relied upon and reproduced the category of the Arab terrorist savage to trigger as well as enable the continuity and justification for the ongoing genocide. Savagery not only delineates how the jungle's quote-unquote unrestrained barbarism on October the 7th has been unleashed onto the civilized garden, but also mobilizes the ground from which the moral impetus for the Zionist genocidal violence proceeds. So October the 7th becomes a marker of what qualifies as the absolute beastliness, or if you want, the jungle against the only democracy in the Middle East, in Friedman's words. Zionist war generals and their allies in the civilized West, and that ranges from high-profile politicians to media propagators and analysts across the whole range of fascist, liberal, and even some self-proclaimed Marxists, leftist circles, join forces to agree on one unquestionable fact: Hamas equates hysteric killing and rapists. Statements declaring that this fight is about forces of light versus darkness, humans versus human animals, perfectly capture colonial humanizing discourse that decolonial theorists chart for us, wherein the civilizational impetus of the forces of the light derives from and emerges in direct response to the savage's infinite deferral to become human, meaning white bourgeois man. They are more fit to be called, a la the Darwinist term, as subspecies because of the inherent qualities, hysteric killing and raping, that renders them essentially lacking in reason, morality, and rationality. In other words, the savage is everything that the white man is not. The latter's killing is constructed as clean, calculated, targeted, surgical, dispassionate, and of course, always in self-defense. In addition, the killing itself stands the moral ground of ridding humanity from the monstrosity of the beasts. The beastliness projected into Gaza, the realm of the jungle, is manifest in IDF daily videos documenting, and I say here in the most ironic sense, the care that they bestow upon the Gazan populace as they take their civilizing strolls in the Gazan jungle. In some videos, we see how animality is elevated from the beastliness of the indigenous Palestinians. In others, the savagery of the jungle reveals through sexualized projections where unchecked whoreness or unlimited perversion lurks beneath externally enforced taboos, as Mr. Freud describes of savages. Most importantly, the delineation of the boundary between humans and beasts is not merely an ideological construction that colonialists advance within a civilizing discourse. Rather, such humanizing projections emerge within the set of social relations that US-led imperialism has sought to maintain in the entire region for decades. We need to turn no further than the work of third world Arab Marxists to unpick the layers of what we mean by US-led imperialism, including the one concerning the functionality of the Zionist settler colonial outpost to this project. And so far, we've had great speakers on this course to turn to understand what imperialism means. So just to go over it one more time, imperialism refers to the process of capital accumulation or surplus value extraction, where development is apportioned unequally along racial and class lines, unquote. This is where the boundaries between the south of the world and the north get drawn, rendering the South as the site of exploitation for accumulation of capital in the imperial core. Ali al-Qadri frames the mode of accumulation advanced under imperialism as accumulation by waste. His analytics depart from traditional Marxian lens in its Eurocentric approach to instead center a third world and mainly taking the case of the Arab region, showing how waste is what he calls an intrinsic characteristic to the domain of production under US-led imperialism. US domination of the region, which have killed through direct waging of war around 5 million people, and that's only since 9/11. This domination of the region wastes Arab life, Al-Qadri tells us. To kill Arab life is to shorten its labor longevity. Thus, it's the ultimate form of cheapening labor power under capital. And doing so is not some sort of unwanted output or collateral damage, but rather the purposeful killing or wasting of human life, of Arab indigenous Palestinian life, is a sphere of production and an end in itself, as Qadri describes it. So to say that it is a sphere of production is to reveal that wasted life through imperialist and colonial encroachment were outputs as well as inputs into surplus value making. Now, Zionism, as you have learned so far as well through this course, has a fundamental role to play within the waste industry of US capital hegemony. Palestinian resistance movements back in the 60s understood this very well when they told us that Zionism is a spearhead of imperialism. Being a European settler colonial formation as much as the United States, Israel incubates a mode of social reproduction that promotes imperialist values and secures US interests in the Arab region and beyond. Historically, what binds them together is a racist, capitalist, and heteropatriarchal what I call heteroconquest also in my work, needed for the continued domination of the indigenous, poor, and racialized people of the world. US military, economic, and ideological investment in Israel has never been revealed as much as during this latest genocidal war. Why is that? Because every aspect of being of this genocidal entity, its liberal, progressive, democratic ideological values, its military capacity, economic strength, engrosses its imperial functionary role within the entire Middle East region. And there is no better than Herzl himself to return to when he proposed the very functionary role of the to-be Jewish state to his then British imperial allies. So it is this historic role in relation to Euro and US-centered global capital that compels Western Europeans to run to the savior in moral, political, and economic terms of the Herzlian Jewish state, whilst their allies in Washington feel obliged to deploy their aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean Sea. The Zionists and their reactionary allies, the Gulf monarchies in the region, are a fundamental cog in the continuity of the waste industry assigned by imperialism. The genocidal war that's been unfolding for the past 6 months now, and we've entered the 7th as of today, is an intensified form of the waste industry. Whereas before the genocidal onslaught, Gazans were facing a slow death, their caloric intake controlled entirely by the occupiers besieging Gaza by air, land, and sea. The recent intensification of the killing perfectly encapsulates the waste industry of colonial capitalism in its epitomized form. At this juncture, one might ask, but how does the body become wrapped up in the myth-making medium of Western invested genocide? A whole panoply of bodies, disfigured, tortured, mutilated, burnt, decomposed, degraded, crushed, starved, and thieved, even as they attempt to lay restless and nameless in gruesome mass graves. Numbers and bodies collide to produce a percentage of conferred collateral damage. 70% are women and children, he is told in reference to Biden. But in this lies no truth, he responds. The only truth imperialists know and propagate is that a worthy Indian is a scalped Indian, a worthy African is a blackened enslaved African, and a worthy Arab is a GDAM decimated terrorist. Wasting is the logic through which colonial capitalism reduces life in its expansive capacity to bits of flesh among wreckage and rubble, chunks of dead meat for Gaza's hungry dogs to chew on, thereby materializing what I call, borrowing from Hortney's pillars, a scene of unprotected flesh, of terrorist wasted flesh, ungendered. Ungendering relies on the ideological and material reduction of the other to terrorist subspecies. Thus, their dangerous casting outside the sex-gendered field of signification is required within the socioeconomic domain of accumulation by waste that Zionism and US imperialism maintains. At the same time, however, ungendering sustains a symbiotic relationship with the gendering scripts reifying the epistemological structures of settler colonialism and imperialism. This is where racialized others could turn from being terrorist subspecies to various modified versions of sexed and gendered identifications as per what is seen within the shifting calibrations of Western bourgeois ideology. We can think of how pinkwashing relies on and reproduces gendered sexed categories, such as the oppressed, veiled Arab woman and the in need of savior LGBT Arab. These colonial projections, where Arab bodies are being written and conceived of as oppressed and in need of savior, are part and parcel of the waste industry, capturing the violence of abstraction long identified in Marxian analysis. In other words, these ideological concepts that colonizers project onto Arab bodies attempt not only to produce gendered and sexed affiliations that are split from their specific materiality, but the colonizers and imperialists quite literally invest in these affiliations to activate accumulation by waste. This is perfectly captured in the mantra of save the gays and the women of Iraq by bombing the hell out of Iraqis. Same logic utilized also in Palestine. The question then becomes, is historical abstraction all we are left with, or might there still be room to rupture the imperial and settler colonial scripts of gendering and ungendering? It is my contention that one needs to look no further than the material reality of the Palestinian indigenous body in its capacity to inform the anti-imperial and decolonial ruptures that dwell against dominant epistemological structures. In my own work, I chart the social and historical forces. These are just some examples of pinkwashing. We can talk about this in the discussion. In my own work, I chart the social and historical forces that enabled the emergence of anti-colonial counterscripts to gendered and sexed configurations, defining the contours of Zionist settler expandability. Palestinian mobilizing against pinkwashing is not simply an act of unveiling colonial investment ideologically and materially in women and gay rights to serve a moral and civilizational, hence the humanizing impetus of Zionism that I've talked about so far. Rather, more crucially, these anti-pinkwashing mobilizations demand of us to seek the alternate epistemes that have been buried beneath the social and conceptual categories abstracting away from the materiality of history. When Palestinian organizers in Al-Qaus for sexual and gender diversity in Palestinian society explain their firm rejection of single-issue approach to issues concerned with sexuality, they do so through historicizing the very journey that mobilize queerness as what we call a radical approach to political mobilization and decolonization. That is, Zionist colonization of Palestinian indigenous bodies and lands animated activist political reconstitution by virtue of growing away from Zionist and Western LGBT frameworks to instead become more in tune with the material reality embedding Palestinian indigenous bodies in a struggle for humanity. In that process, we see a definition of Palestinian queer affiliation that is uncompromisingly Palestinian, first and foremost, and identifies itself within the terrains of Palestinian national struggle for freedom and liberation. At the same time, anti-pinkwashing activists reveal to us that the violence embedding the same identity affiliations that Zionist and Western allies seek to impose onto the Palestinian context. There are psychosocial manifestations of this violence, in that it requires of Palestinians to emerge as victims of their homophobic, pride-negating society and seek the freedom that their colonizer is supposedly going to extend to them. Waging international calls for boycott while being active contributors on the ground in political mobilization against the genocidal entity, anti-pinkwashers or pinkwatchers not only show the power that Palestinian queers have, contrary to all this Zionist and Western victimhood projections, but most importantly, these actions gesture towards a different vocabulary that emerge from the set of social relations. Folks from Al-Qaus affirm, and I'm sharing here some snippets from speeches, interviews, and other written statements, where activists state that rather than seeking pride, we seek dignity. Rather than seeking the liberatory facade of individual capitalism, we seek to be rooted in communities. Rather than seeking the occupiers' supposed pink doors, we stand by the occupied right to wage their anti-colonial uprising. And rather than singling out a struggle on the basis of sexuality, we trouble the very premise of bourgeois ideology as it abstracts sexuality from the violent structures, being settler colonialism and imperialism, maintaining the same bourgeois dominance. This emphasis on bringing back the structures of oppression, which the imperialists and settler colonialists always seek to hide in their bourgeois projections of what queerness or womanhood ought to signify for indigenous Palestinians, stand in the face of post-structuralist and queer feminist critiques, revealing their grave limitations. These limitations manifest on a few intertwined fronts. First, the liquidation of class and structural analysis with which French theory school of self-proclaimed post-structuralists from Foucault, Deleuze to Derrida has led to the production of a dehistoricized conception of identity and the class struggle that have been waged around them. In doing so, we see not only the dilution of the national question and its importance for those who remain under the rubble of settler colonial violence and imperial aggression, but we see scholarly propagation of bourgeois analysis that is actively attacking what, but we see scholarly propagation of bourgeois analysis actively attacking what they describe as a Puritan political stance. This is particular for when the queer or feminist groups refuse to normalize Israel and wage political activism again, in the face of that. Instead, what these critiques seem to offer is a glorification of sex-gendered configurations that are conceived within a quote-unquote hybrid or anti-essentialist dimension. And so by extension, they are telling us that queers and feminists should grow beyond and above national, ethnic, and other divides, activating political paradigm of coexistence, for example, when it comes to Palestine, Israel. Others are so invested in a deconstructionist critique to the point of advocating queerness in its subjectless capacity or the zone of the death drive. This is where queerness becomes the zone of no futurity, meaning against the logic of reproductive futurism that heteronormativity supposedly imposes everywhere, as if racialized working class people are not already confined to the realm of death and engineered wasting and shortening of their lives. So to substantiate further my critique of these limitations, I am going to turn to a recent article that has been published by Judith Butler in the London Review of Books in the wake of the Al-Aqsa flood operation, October 7th event. On October 19th, Judith Butler writes her piece titled The Compass of Mourning, in which she reflects on the moral and political lessons to be learned from the rampant discussions about the violence committed by Hamas. I take Butler as an example because she's quite the post-structuralist, queer, feminist, scholar. Her work always remits attention from both scholars and activists in many parts of the world. And this piece in particular was translated into many languages in what some activists thought is a radical piece. Butler's article begins with her unequivocal condemnation of what she describes as the terrifying, what she quote, and I'm quoting, terrifying and revolting Hamas massacre, end quote. And then it moves on to repeat familiar argument with regards to the value of nonviolence as a moral compass to stand by and a political recipe for Israelis and Palestinians under what she named in previous work as a cohabitation paradigm. Supposedly acknowledging the colonial context to Israel-Palestine, Butler nonetheless goes on to challenge what stands a dubious moral stance of some pro-Palestine activists. She references the Harvard-based Palestine Solidarity Group. In her view, the group's contextualization of the apartheid regime as the only one to blame for the escalation of violence serves, as she describes, to exonerate Hamas's hideous killings, unquote, thereby failing the moral compass that she graciously sets out for us. And you can see here a few quotes from that piece on the screen. And looking at these quotes, it is rather interesting on a discursive level even, to note how Butler's eliminatory priority with regards to Hamas precedes the one that she has for the supremacist Jewish settler colonial regime. Whilst at times Butler attempts to acknowledge the necessity of historical contextualization regarding the existence of groups like Hamas, however, her momentary engagement with history recedes in the face of overwhelming theoretical abstraction dictated by an idealist vision of nonviolence. She tells us that alternative political and moral possibilities lies in, quote, struggle for a free Palestine in which Hamas would be dissolved or superseded by groups with nonviolent aspirations for cohabitation, unquote. The notion of cohabitation or coming together of Jews and Palestinians, which Butler proposes as the most productive political and moral trajectory, is emblematic of the very identitarian and essentializing base of Butler's theorization, despite the fact that Butler would strongly claim otherwise. As Bangalia and I have argued back in 2014, there are dangers that inhere in using cohabitation as a structuring analytic. And these dangers derive from the very fact that such framework overwhelmingly takes us to a place where we have to fixate on the deconstruction of two binaristic identities. And in doing so, it takes our attention away from the mode of social reproduction that Zionism incorporates, not only in relation to Palestine, but within its functionary role as a military outpost for US-led imperialism in the Arab region as a whole. Furthermore, Butler's idealist position with regards to cohabitation and the primacy of nonviolence, acting as a ground from which moral condemnation of Palestinian violence should follow, manifests in her own projection of Palestinian violence as nothing but a mirror of Israeli violence. She suggests that PSC, the Harvard-based Solidarity Group, stance asks us to see, quote, Palestinian violence as a continuation of Israeli violence. Doing so then problematically entails that there is only one source of moral culpability, where even Palestinians do not own their own violent acts as their own, unquote. Butler's moralizing argument around nonviolence not only abstracts historic material processes, casting colonized to the zone of wasted being, but is equally doing the work of essentializing indigenous counter-violence, effectively reducing it to the set of moral criterions to which colonizers and colonized should supposedly measure. And this echoes liberal elite mantra of, I condemn, do you condemn the violence on both sides, which we've been hearing a lot from liberal circles, but also, others who urge us to find the Palestinian Gandhi, This argument labor the bourgeois root of Butler's moral compass in its detachment from the cumulative social forces animating indigenous counter-violence and thus irreducibility to an image of the cruelty and utter depravity of the colonizing regime. Butler's compass reveals an attachment to the empire's long durée of ethical culpabilization of the Palestinian savage terrorist. And this is my final bit. I'm finished there. So anti-imperial feminism gestures towards a new moral praxis that is to be found within the revolutionary well of those who, following so many years of dehumanization and besiegement, have the full right, in the words of the late George Habash, to protect our revolution. Our code of morals is our revolution, always insisted. In a recent interview with the revolutionary figure Layla Khaled, she reflected on Al-Aqsa flood operation by reaffirming that the only choice we have is to fight and to liberate our land, including through armed resistance. She then states that the right of the occupied people for resistance to restore their freedom is in the UN Charter. It's a fundamental law. Where there is oppression, there is resistance, and that history taught us that people resist to keep their dignity and land, unquote. Khalid's articulation of these words came in the context of reflecting on the hijacking operations that she was part of back in the late 60s, which of course also merited her the terrorist label by Zionists and imperialists to this date. When recounting some of the details of the day of the operation and how, as she took control of the cockpit, Khalid reminds of how she took the name of the late martyr Shadia Abu Ghazali, the first Palestinian martyred woman in the wake of 1967. And you should Google how Abu Ghazali was martyred. She then reflects on how, upon encountering Western media, all she was asked by an American journalist was, quote, "How many hours you stand in front of the mirror?" Such a question for Khalid sits within the wider Western projections about Arab women viewed within a passive, domesticated lens. The gendering scripts of empire go hand in hand with the ungendering processes, casting Khalid, like many other Palestinian resistance figures, to the realm of the terrorist, nonsensical, amoral savage. A recent cancellation of a seminar at US-based university with Khalid, and Dr. Abdulhadi was also part of organizing this seminar, was propelled by anti-terrorism laws, which brought the president of the university to remind that, quote, "Terrorist violence conflicts with academic freedom. It is at odds with the values that universities hold dear: reason, dispassion, freedom of speech and inquiry, respect for individuals and individual liberties," unquote. However, lying beneath these ungendering scripts of empire is the very words of Khalid when she defiantly asserts, "We are ready to pay blood and flesh to liberate this land." Her words gesture towards an anti-imperial feminism where counter-violence is the site of inventiveness of the colonized flesh once it emerges beyond the political, moral, and material taxonomies dictating colonized non-being. Thank you for listening, and I'll stop here.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Dr. Alqaisiya. That was really fantastic, highly informative, compelling talk. Really has provided us with such strong materialist theoretical framework and really crucial concepts for understanding these themes: accumulation through waste, the gendering and ungendering scripts, the ideological material reduction of the other to not the zone of non-being to justify settler colonial violence and genocide, and also the importance of anti-imperialist counterscripts to the capitalist imperialist discourse. And that last section on Layla Khalid really illustrates so powerfully what these counterscripts look like, an anti-imperialist feminism that valorizes resistance. So that was really, really brilliant. Thank you so much. So now we will be moving on to our next speaker, and just pull up my. Excuse me one second, I just lost. Sorry. Okay. Give me 1 second. I have too many tabs open and I managed to lose the one. I'm so sorry with the
I sent them to you in the chat. If you look
Yes,
at the
yes.
chat, you'll find it there.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just had it open, but managed to close it by accident. So here it comes. My computer is just being a little slow. Give me a second. Okay. So our next speaker, we are very, very lucky to have with us Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi, who is the founding director and senior scholar of Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies program at San Francisco State University. She is co-founding editorial board member of Islamophobia Studies Journal and serves as the editorial collective serves on the editorial Colectiva for Chicana and Latina Studies Journal of Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social, a policy advisor for Al Shabaka. She's a member of the founding collective of the Institute for Critical Study of Zionism. And I'm sure Essam is going to be sharing and already has hopefully the incredible list of publications of Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi. We're very lucky to have you with us today. Thank you, Rabab.
Thank you so much for having me. And of course, I begin from San Francisco State by acknowledging that my university is, okay, why is this not, hold on, yeah, sits on the stolen indigenous land of the Ohlone Nation that continues to be indigenous as we continue to reaffirm our commitment to defeat the settler colonial project in the US and elsewhere. And I do make this acknowledgement as an indigenous Palestinian whose land is colonized by Israeli settler colonialism, and where it's essential for anyone who comes to visit or lives on the indigenous land of Palestine, all of Palestine, not only to acknowledge whose land it is, but no matter how long or short they stay, and no matter how good or noble their intentions are, the fact that they continue to reside and visit and express solidarity, whether they are occupiers, visitors, or comrades in arms, their presence must be validated by the indigenous people of the land if they do wish to stay and be not to be defined as settlers. I also want to take just a moment of silence to honor the fallen. Everybody mentioned that. You spoke about that, Corina, when you started, and also Walaa spoke about that. But I want to honor them again, from Palestine to streets of US to South Africa, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, Vietnam, Kashmir, and of course in Gaza. You've mentioned what's happening with Gaza and the huge losses. And I think, as we all say, and as Rifat Al-Harir said, we are not numbers. We mentioned the numbers just for people to understand how horrifying this genocide, this ongoing massacre is. But again, every single person has a story behind them. So I'm not going to refer to all of the destruction that has happened. I just want to mention a couple of things that are very relevant to us here. First, as academics, the destruction of the academic, cultural, and heritage life completely. All the universities have been bombed, the schools, many scholars have been killed, many cultural workers, artists have been eliminated and assassinated, journalists have been killed. It's unbelievable the amount of the destruction that has been going on. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that 50% of the people in Gaza are young and youth. 70% of the people in Gaza are refugees. Actually, they come from from areas surrounding Gaza. So when they went onto October 7th to some of the kibbutzim, some of them are actually built on the lands that belong to people in Gaza who are in refugee camp or fifth or sixth generation in refugee camps. 85% of the population is displaced, and the majority of the population does not have water, clean drinking water, food, and or any kind of medical or nourishment. I think it's really important for us to remember that, because with the killing of the world central kitchen workers, and it's really important that the whole world rose up and was horrified by it. There is a lot, very little mention of the Palestinian driver who was driving the international supporters, and also there isn't as much mention of the names of every single Palestinian, who what happened to them, how they were killed, and so on. So that's really important. The other thing that I think is very significant for our own discussion is that there are 55 to 60,000 pregnant women today in Gaza who are going to either give birth, get killed while they're pregnant, or give birth under very difficult conditions. Their children might survive, they might not survive, they might be able to be in with care, with medical workers, they may not, because all maternity wards have been destroyed. And there is even incubators. Children have died, babies have died in incubators because of the cutoff of the fuel, of the electricity, of supplies, and so on. And the reason I mentioned the 55 to 60,000 pregnant women, not because I want children, not because I want to emphasize women and children first. I have a serious problem with that argument that only uses that in order to elicit a charity and sympathy without actually making attention and paying attention to the value of Palestinian men. So it's really, and when we talk about gender analysis means gender analysis. It doesn't mean only women and children to the exclusion of men or non-gender binary people and so on. It's really important to mention that the other issue that actually this raises the whole question of the Israeli obsession with the so-called demographic bomb that is sticking. The more Palestinians that are born and they come on, which repeats the words of the Golda Meir, the first and only Prime Minister of Israel, who said that she has nightmares every single time she hears that the Palestinian child has been born. And the reason I'm mentioning all of this, because this is part and parcel of the definition of genocide, according to not only the International Court of Justice, as South Africa pushed the decision. It is what genocide is: elimination of a whole people. And this is what the Zionist project has been attempting to do since its creation in the late 19th century, and since over 100 years Palestinians have been fighting it. The target is the killing, the murder, the erase. All of it is intended to erase the people who are on the land and intended to actually genocide them. It's not accidental, it's not random, it's not an aberration, it's not some bad apples in the Israeli army doing this or that. This is part and parcel of the Israeli Zionist project that is very much connected to imperialism, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I wanted to also say that tomorrow, and the context that we're working on, is that one of the historical contexts is that tomorrow is the anniversary of Deir Yassin massacre. It's the 76th anniversary of the massacre. And I mentioned that because there are two connections to what we are talking about. One is that Deir Yassin massacre was not the only massacre. There were many massacres before it, and there are many massacres after it. We are hearing of massacres now because of the way the production of knowledge is happening, that in the sense that Israel declassifies some archives to which people can go and look at, as well as the British colonial forces. And so we are producing our own archives as indigenous colonized people, but really the archives of what has happened, what's going on, the numbers are very similar also to the settler colonial state in the US, in the sense that they are meticulously writing every name of kidnapped and enslaved African. They've written all of this, they've recorded a lot of this stuff. That's there. Unfortunately, these are the sources. So this is a problematic notion that we should be talking about what has happened. But Deir Yassin became a very important juncture in the history, because Israeli Haganah, before it wasn't even Israel yet. This was April 9th, 1948. Israel was founded May 15th, 1948. This has the Haganah, Zionist militia said that without Deir Yassin, Israel might not have been possible, because Deir Yassin stood on the road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the supply road for Israeli military weapons and so on. Now, the other aspect of is Deir Yassin itself no longer exists. The village no longer exists. There is in its place something called the Jerusalem Forest. And so the whole village, as many 532 at least villages in Palestine, have been completely destroyed. And the destruction is going on every single day, as we heard yesterday, chasing shepherds in Palestinian hills, shepherding their sheep and so on, killing them, chasing them off their land and so on. But also this was the site where the young Palestinian boy, Muhammad Abu Khdeir, was taken and made to drink kerosene and burned alive. And Muhammad Abu Khdeir, there are several issues to raise here, is that the whole question of defying and challenging the Israeli tales and fabrications and hasbara after October 7th, that Palestinians burn babies in ovens, which turned out to be completely untrue. We knew it was untrue, but we know that between Muhammad Abu Khdeir, the Wabshi, a whole bunch of the whole burning and attacking, who is actually committing that. Secondly, is that Muhammad Abu Khdeir, and this is really important for gender analysis, and it also relates to the whole question of queer liberation and queer injustice in Palestine, is that when he was killed, the Israeli police spread the rumor that it was his family that killed him, his parents that killed him, because they were, quote unquote, cleansing family honor. And this is building on the colonialist, imperialist, long-term notion in anthropology, in all social sciences and so on, that there is the whole, that our society, our region is very much has an additional DNA, exceptional DNA, that said that we are excessively homophobic, excessively misogynist, and that the honor killing could be a crime of passion anywhere else, and nobody is condoning killing. Honor killing is part and parcel of our societies. So by spreading that, the Israeli police was actually doing several things. One is that it was deflecting, as what Israel is doing today, and its Zionist propaganda and its neoliberal and colonialist allies in the White House and elsewhere, deflecting from what's going on, the massacres and the genocide that's going on, and shifting it elsewhere, but also raising something that will ring in the imaginary of the world, of the Israeli imaginary, even in the imaginary of some sectors of the Palestinian society and the whole world, that this is what these people do. So don't feel surprised that and if it wasn't for the Muhammad Abu Khdeir's father actually saving the video footage that the Israeli police tried to take, they tried to confiscate, and he said no, and he held into it, that showed that the Israelis are the ones who kidnapped the boy and took him to the forest and burned him alive. The notion and the whole tale that Muhammad Abu Khdeir was killed by his family on the basis of family honor would have continued. And this is something that we hear again and again and again. And I think it's really, and this is when we talk about, and Deir Yassin also speaks to the many massacres, including Sabra and Shatila, and the massacres that are happening today in Gaza. The genocide that's happening today in Gaza is also targeting all families. Whole families are completely being eliminated. Not a single member is remaining in all of these families. So I think it's really important for us to keep, what does this really mean? And its centrality. It's not just a horror act. It's a horror act, but its centrality to the settler colonial project that's also very much resembles a settler colonial project in the US. Both of them were based on settlers taking over people's land, indigenous, trying to decimate the indigenous people, settling on their land, and actually building into what later becomes capitalism. And then, we know that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, as Lenin teaches us. This is where some of the connections are, and I will come back to that a little bit later as well. But I think it's also the massacres and killing and trying to hide what is going on is very, very much part and parcel of the settler colonial project, colonialism and settler colonial project. It happens all the time. It is not something that only happens to Palestinians. It happens everywhere. In Algeria, it happens in the Turtle Island, the Americas, in Mexico, in Chile, in Argentina, South Africa, anywhere else in the world. So that's one major aspect. The other thing I think is that the reason I'm mentioning Deir Yassin is because in our project Teaching Palestine, we insist on commemorating anniversaries of marginalized and colonized people. And the commemoration we do is not similar to the discussion in the Eurocentric and colonial production of knowledge that says commemoration is just nationalist commemoration of narrow nationalism because people are xenophobic, these communities are xenophobic, and to create their own spaces to the exclusion of others. Actually, these commemorations serve the purpose of reminding the old of what has happened, passing on the knowledge to the younger generation, because there are many generations that have been completely eliminated, passing it on, and also saying, what does this really mean in the life of a people? And commemorating themselves places the center of analysis on the colonized and the marginalized people, who can define their own reality according to their own terms, not according to the terms of the colonizers and the occupiers. So this is it's not only pedagogically device, that's also very vital, but it legitimizes justice-centered knowledge production as a valid, and even more so than knowledge that proclaims to be quote unquote neutral, as absent of political consideration, as if any of this stuff actually is possible, or qualitatively superior. But it also to accentuate the dialectical relationship scholarship and pedagogy have to activism, advocacy, and community organizing, and not allowing it to be outside of the classroom. So this is really, really important when we're discussing where would this happen. We're not producing knowledge only outside of the classroom or only inside the classroom. Knowledge is being produced everywhere in multiple locations, and it's very important to emphasize and center the marginalized, the colonized, place them at the center of analysis, what they are worth. And I want to give a shout out to students at Columbia University and students at Pomona and students around the US and the Western world who are being, and also Palestinian students in Israeli universities who are being crushed every single day by the administration of their university. That's very much tied, part and parcel, to the imperialist and the colonialist project and the settler colonial project. Tomorrow is also the birthday of Ghassan Kanafani and Layla Khalid. And it's really important for us to actually also understand their roles as Palestinian and internationalist intellectuals for liberation. And they understand why is it that there is always a constant settler colonial project to erase them, flatten their histories, or to dismiss them completely, as the Zionists and the neoliberal agenda sought to establish to prevent passing the history from generation and generation. We know that Kanafani has never even carried a gun. Not that, and I'm not actually undermining armed resistance, but Kanafani never. Kanafani was theorizing. Kanafani was actually placing the story and the narrative of the Palestinians on Palestinians' or terms, refused to answer questions even on the terms of colonizer, and said we're going to re-raise the question, ask the questions anew. And this is part of the reason why he was assassinated, along with many other intellectuals and leaders in Palestine as in other parts of the world. Layla Khalid has been demonized, as Dr. Walaa Alqaisiya mentioned, and demonized, and also additionally demonized anew when Dr. Tomomi Kanakawa and I organized an open classroom for our students, because it was COVID, because we had only online, we could only teach online, and we invited Layla Khalid along with other 4 international luminaries: Roni Kasril from South Africa, who was part of the African National Congress, Sekou Odinga, the late, who just passed away, a leader of the Black Liberation Movement here, spent 33 years in prison, Laura Whitehorn, who is a queer Jewish anti-Zionist activist who spent 14 years in prison, and Rula Abu Daho, a Palestinian professor at Birzeit University who spent 10 years in prison as a former political prisoner, to have this conversation on gender justice and resistance. And the title of it is Whose Narratives? And basically, we were talking about people being able to speak about their narrative. So the class was completely shut down. At the end of April, we are coming up to the arbitration where Dr. Kanakawa and I basically grieved against the university. We won our grievances. The university president vetoed. And so we are going to arbitration now. But the reason we believe that it was done, and the reason that Layla was labeled as a terrorist, is in order to flatten who she is. Not only flatten what she did back in 1970 when she hijacked the planes, and the narrative in which she explains what has happened, and even her book starts actually with a passage about the international revolutions everywhere around the world. She speaks about that throughout, again and again and again. And also, but also the way in her history, how she even spoke about the fact that when the PFLP hijacked the plane on her behalf, she thought that this is going to go to her head. And she decided pedagogically, intellectually, in activist terms and so on, to go to the refugee camps in order for her not to get to be too big. This is a woman who had gone through plastic surgeries in order to change her appearance. Or listen to all the sacrifices that she's gone through. So to have her come on screen to visit with our students, 76-year-old grandmother at the time, to speak with our students as a person, it was necessary for the Zionist movement to completely prevent that from happening, because having Layla there humanizes. So in terms of to make the Palestinians, take the Palestinians in the zone of non-being, and the theoretical analysis that Walaa has already mentioned, this was necessary. It was necessary, and it was necessary to only talk about Layla Khalid as a terrorist. Even though when she was shut down, the 23 minutes into the video, she was actually arguing about terrorism and defining it. So if there was an interest in the production of knowledge, why is it that somebody who's actually speaking about it and analyzing and speaking for themselves at the center of their own analysis was shut down? And why is it that somebody who actually speaks, yes, she took the name of Shadi Abu Ghazali, another Palestinian woman who was martyred. She has been a very long time feminist icon. She refused to answer the questions in every single journalist that asked her, you know, how many hours you spend in front of the mirror? Do you have a boyfriend or something like that? Why did you change? How do you feel about changing your appearance? And she thought all of these are ridiculous questions. Why are you asking me about that? And she repeats it again and again and again. Why are you asking me about that? You're not asking me about the role that I'm playing. Why am I playing what I'm playing, and so on? And she actually, even the whole question that she donned, quote unquote, the glamorous image to conduct her operation, which is a device, subversive device of passing against colonialism, is never even talked about. It's just only referred to that she looked glamorous and so on. But if she hadn't looked that way, if she had gone in fatigues, of course she would be arrested. So even that, she was deprived. Her narrative is even deprived of her ability to speak for herself or her history, being very active in the Union of Palestinian Women, being very active in all sorts of ways in many areas and aspects of Palestinian organizing and so on. It was necessary to do so. And it was necessary to do so by colonial feminists who in our university president and our university provost, white feminists who suffer from the white fragility, what people call white fragility syndrome, but also are very much influenced by what you spoke about, Walaa, the whole question of the colonial, Islamophobic, Orientalist, racist feminism, and the way that they were doing, even the language that the university president used was taken word by word from the language that was used in many of the Zionist groups, including the Lawfare Project, which was the first one that actually launched the attack. But then all the Zionist groups jumped on the bandwagon, and also even the head of the FCC, the U.S. the communication said, "Oh, we don't really need to hear. We don't need to hear from all people," and so on. All of this stuff, it was necessary to silence her, because also there is pre-built Islamophobia, Orientalism, racism, and colonialism before even Layla Khalid appears on the scene. This is something that we have seen all along, and this is why the university president, for example, never even asked me and Professor Kinakawa, come and talk to me. What were you doing? We are faculty, we're scholars, we're intellectuals. What? She never even asked us, what were you trying to do? What were you trying to accomplish? Even saying, are you crazy? This has never happened at all. Nobody asked us. We were accused of being material support for terrorism. Our university provost told us that we might be imprisoned, and we might have to pay a fine. They refused to provide us lawyers to protect us. It was movement lawyers who stepped up and so on. So this is very much big part and parcel of taking Layla Khalid from her milieu and basically flattening her, not only flattening her, but turning her, demonizing her as a demon who's a boogeyman, who is actually there to scare people. And so, and this is the reason I'm saying this is because it's really important for us to talk about the whole question of commemorating and understanding what is it in the stories of somebody like Layla Khalid, which we call the living archives in teaching Palestine, who are able to pass on more than has been covered, let's say in the mainstream press or in the English language, which is available a lot in the Arabic. And you've quoted many of her interviews many of her interviews and citing. Okay, so the next, actually, there's a lot of the stuff I was going to say, you already covered it. Thank you so much, Walaa. So I'm going to just fill in some of the things that I think are really important, is the whole question of the colonial feminism itself. And I think it's really important for us to think about that. The problematic with this and the most damaging aspect of it is that it's feminism. Feminism is supposed to be about women's liberation. In everybody's mind, it connotes something positive, so it connotes social change towards justice. So when it's colonial feminists who are actually involved in it, it is not the same as settler colonial regimes, Netanyahu or Biden or Trump or any of these settler colonial imperialist leaders speak about that. It actually has a much more sense of legitimacy when they do that. And this is why settler colonial feminism now is actually working very, very hard, along with the Zionist Hasbara, with the Israeli government, with the US, and repeating it again and again. It's also not accidental. And the reason, part of the reason for that is because colonial feminism is not isolated from the whole question of colonialism, the settler colonial regime, and colonial feminism. If you read all their words, you come again and again, and they'll say, our country, speaking about the US, we need to change. They speak about ameliorating the United States. They speak about reform that can, in order to restore our country to its traditional values. What are the traditional values of the United States? What was the Declaration of Independence and the United? What was it about? What does it exactly say? It confirms, it enshrines the right of property. It enshrines the right of white people, white men in particular, and in which, by the way, white women as well, in all these plantations and everywhere else, played not only a forced, imposed upon role, which colonial feminists tell us women were forced. No, they weren't forced. They actually willingly participated in that because they benefited from the system as well. And they also abused the people who were controlling. And this is actually quite problematic because some of the people who led the movement in the United States, for example, at the Seneca Convention, which is named after an indigenous group, nation, they came actually from a conference where they attended anti-slavery conference in Britain. And they drew a lot from the indigenous people's matriarchal structures and so on. But then they forgot all of that. And they sought to support not only the vote for women, but also and oppose somebody like Frederick Douglass, who said we should not really allow divide and rule, a colonial device, but actually speak for the vote for Black people and for women and so on. But they sided with the white men property owners, hetero, Anglo settlers, in order for them to perpetuate, because they are part and parcel of this. So this is when you're talking about colonialism and settler colonialism, it is inevitably has to produce imperialism. It cannot just survive on its own. It has to go within and outside of the country in order to have new ventures, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to fund their war machine, and they wouldn't be able to fund their industries, and they wouldn't be able to pack their pockets and reproduce the benefits and the interest of the 1%. So I think it's really important for us to talk about that. And you mentioned, you put the picture of the martyr Emmett T. Hill, who was lynched, a Black boy who was lynched, and then the woman who accused him after only last year or the year before, she lied. She said she lied. But yani, what's the point? بعد خراب البصرة, as we say in Arabic. But this is also, the suffragists also had a serious problem with one of the leading Black feminists, Ida B. Wells, who was working on women's liberation, as well as leading anti-lynching campaign of Black men. And they thought that this was also odd for her to be actually participating on behalf of Black men, because that's not our problem. Our problem is only women. So it is also the essentialism itself. And I think we only say it's essentialism, but it's not just essentialism. It actually serves the colonial and the imperialist and the capitalist purposes, because it says all women are the same. It eliminates class differences. It eliminates structural differences. It eliminates all differences in all sorts of ways: language, immigration, communities, everything, but definitely eliminates class and propagates capitalism by saying everybody is the same. So we really don't have a problem with the class and so on. We just have a problem with the no, not even hetero, patriarchy. We only have a problem with patriarchy. We don't have a problem with anything else. So I think this is really important for us to keep in mind, because a lot of the times it sounds as if this is innocuous and so on. Within the colonial feminists, I want to specifically, there's a whole lot of history which we spoke about that, continuing again and again and again from 1985 in Nairobi, where Bella Abzug and Betty Friedan, and Betty Friedan was one of the immense intellectuals of the feminist movement. She's the one who wrote the book saying that women should not should be able, the feminine mystique, that should go out to work, which was very interesting, because she was only talking about white middle class suburban women who have degrees. Indigenous women, Black women, worked all their lives, worked either in the fields or worked on their backs, forced labor imposed upon them in the slavery, in very repressive systems and so on. But so she's talking about only a particular class that's talking about that. But also she was a very strong Zionist. And she and Bella Abzug told Nawal Saadawi at the Nairobi Women's Conference in 1985, speak about South Africa, but don't mention Palestine. That's not really good. That's divisive. And also, what do you need with that? And part of it is also they were appealing, well, the good thing for Nawal Saadawi, she did not listen to them, but they were also appealing to Nawal's investment in who she is. In the US, Nawal in 1982, her book, which is الوجه العاري للمرأة العربية, became The Hidden Faces of Eve. Arab became universal. And the foreword to it was written by Gloria Steinem. And the book, and I had read the book, some people may know this, I actually had read the book when I was growing up in Arabic, in the library of Nablus, the public library of Nablus. When I saw it in English, I did not really know. I thought, oh, Nawal Saadawi wrote a new book. But it actually was, in its translation, it was completely changed. And if it wasn't for Amal Amir's incisive article in Science Journal, I would not really have known that all of this stuff, this is the same book that was going on. So they were also playing on Nawal Saadawi's importance and interest and investment in becoming part and parcel, continuing being part and parcel of the stars of the feminist movement, of the international feminist movement. And the other thing that I want to actually emphasize is also the domesticity. I spoke about that, but the domesticity of colonial feminisms and the domesticity of imperialism. Imperialism is very much invested in saying things that you keep it domestic within the borders of the United States. Now, if you're really an analytical person, you would know that, first of all, colonial borders are drawn. Borders are not always there forever and ever. They're colonial borders that are set. Secondly, the United States itself reaches very long. It reaches all over the world. It intervenes all over the world. So things are not happening within the US itself. But also the domestication is also sent specifically to women, queers, and communities of color, indigenous communities, saying it is not your place. So there is also an element of racism and hierarchy, superiority, that tells them you should not be part of this. You're not allowed to be part of this. Leave that to the foreign policy experts, the talking heads who are in Washington, who work for the CIA and the State Department and so on and so forth. It is not your best. You don't have the expertise, which takes us back to the first point about what is the production of knowledge and where is knowledge being produced. So this is also another weapon that's used against everybody participating in it and saying that this is a part of it, but it's also the domesticity in terms of domesticating everything within the US itself. So it becomes part of the US nation state, which is in itself an imperialist, colonialist, settler colonial state. And it has been, and it will continue to be until it changed. That whole structure is completely changed. So that this is, how much time do I still have, Corina? I'm good, right? Yes?
Yeah, a couple minutes.
Oh, I have, okay, I need more than a couple of minutes. Maybe I need 5. Okay. So I have I'm sorry, I keep moving because I have some pain that I need to work with. So I wanted to actually also like just say a couple of, oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, I wanted to speak a little bit about the role of Zionism in this particular colonial feminist. And this is some of the stuff I've spoken about before, but some of the stuff I don't know if people have heard it. One is that in 2016, if everybody knows, and so I'm just skipping through all the feminist majority and the Steinem and Ms. Magazine and all of their justifying of the wars in invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, so on. Well, you spoke about that, so I don't need to repeat. But I want to speak specifically about what happened in 2016 after Trump was elected. After Trump was elected, of course, there were a bunch of women created something called Women's March. And this is where it was actually feminism without class conscious. But that wasn't even satisfactory to the Zionist movement because they expelled Black woman and Linda Sarsour, a Palestinian woman, from the leadership of this big march. But there was another march that was organized by a number of feminists who were anti-colonial feminists. It was called International Women's Strike. And it was launched on International Women's Day in 2016, in March. And the International Women's Strike came up with many points that reproduced and discussed about how feminism cannot be separated from its vacuum, how gender and sexual justice is part and parcel of the indivisibility of justice. So they spoke about the wall, the apartheid wall in Palestine, the wall of death between the US and Mexico. They spoke about the water being taken, the need for environmental justice. They spoke about the young woman who was supportive in Columbia University, who was subjected to sexual harassment, and she was actually given refuge in the offices of Students for Justice in Palestine, which is now a band. It's a legal group at Columbia University. And then when the chairs was none other than Rasmiya Odeh, another Palestinian feminist who was imprisoned for a very long time in prison and only released in a prisoner exchange. And Rasmiya was raped in prison. She spoke about her rape. She was in the US. She was a US citizen. She was deported. So they were actually very much opposing to that. And this happened in one article by this young woman, and we don't know where she came from, Emily Shire, asking if there is a place for Zionism in feminism. And some people say no. And I will say, yeah, there is a place for Zionism in colonial feminism, of course. That's where Zionism fits. That's exactly where it fits. It doesn't fit in anti-colonial, internationalist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist feminism, but it fits with these other forms of feminism. Definitely it fits within that. And it's very interesting because soon after that, a Zionist group was founded called Zioness. And it was founded by 2 women, Brooke Goldstein and Amanda Bierman, who were the executive director and member of the board of none other than the Lawfare Project, which calls itself the legal arm of the Israeli support for Israel. And this is the same group that started the battle to shut down Layla Khalid, shut down our class with Layla Khalid. This is the same group that sued me and the university in 2017. This is the same group where Brooke Goldstein, its director, actually said on a video that they erased, but Electronic Intifada said that there are no Palestinians, there is no Islamophobia, and we will make the enemy pay. We will exact a price from anybody who stands up and speaks about Palestine. Interesting thing is that there is a similarity between Israel as settler colonial regime that's stealing the land and the culture and the very essence of Palestine. They stole an image of a South African woman on a motorcycle and they use it for Zionists. They never asked the woman if it's okay for them to use it. I mean, this is kind of like the parallels are so much part of it. And part of it is not a DNA issue. It's a structural issue that has to do with entitlement of groups and individuals and systems that are part and parcel of taking a land of other people, stealing it, setting settler colonies, and believing that they actually are entitled. They have the privilege to be all over the world. So the last point I wanted to mention, I'm stopped with the colonial feminism. I just want to talk about the whole question about Palestinian feminism and speak about a couple of things. One is that when we started organizing here in the US, in New York, in 1982, we were always constantly being asked by even socialist feminists, are you a feminist or a nationalist? It's very, very interesting. And Walaa, you mentioned it a lot, so I'm going to leave it alone now because that's my dissertation. But I wanted to also speak about the ways in which class consciousness has always been part and parcel of the Palestinian women's feminist movement. Even when those who study Palestinian women's studies and Palestinian feminists claim that some are bourgeois, yes, there are some that associations, bourgeois and so on, but actually they were very conscious of the link between Zionism and British colonialism and their relationships to capitalism. This is why there was actually a lot of boycott of businesses, a lot of boycott of the structures of the, and so there was a lot of consciousness, and there is also the sense of internationalism, being part of an internationalist movement. So whenever you see statements by the General Union of Palestinian Women, which is not by any measure by, let's say, radical Palestinian feminist analysis and so on, is considered to be radical, there is always reference to capitalism, to exploitation of the job market, to kind of like the whole question of labor. Work is not only paid work, there is also women's work. I mean, all of these issues. And then if you go to the women's committees, which are more radical and are part of the leftist group and so on, they've also followed on the whole question of how do we make a just society for themselves, and imposed it also at beginning, and then they convinced their comrades, their male comrades, to participate in it in terms of setting up child care whenever there are events or activities. So the women are not necessarily have to get stuck with taking care of the children. The children are for the whole community. And during the 87 Intifada, aside from many, many achievements, and I was going to speak about how people read Engels and Kollontai and so on, but I'm not going to talk about that. But during the Intifada, one of the women's groups borrowed a poem from a Cuban poet and put it in their publication, in the publication in Arabic, that it's a poem that is to the comrades who do not wash their socks. And it was a poem that was, for me, it was a reflection of internationalism. It was a poem loving for the comrades, but also saying that we're going to continue struggling until we win. And it also emphasized the whole question of gender and labor in itself. The last thing I would say is that not all feminists in the imperialist world are colonists, and I think we would be remiss if we do not at least invoke some of the names of the feminists who have been internationalists, anti-Zionists, anti-imperialists, anti-capitalists, who have stood and spoke up at cost to themselves, from June Jordan to
Professor Abdulhadi, are you there? You've frozen.
Oh. Angela Davis and many others today who have spoken about it, and there is so many, and it's really important because their sense and the way they articulated everything was always internationalist, was always anti-imperialist, was always anti-colonial, and there was identification with the struggle of the Palestinian people for liberation, for national, anti-colonial national liberation, that is very, very much tied up to struggle against capitalism, against imperialism, and against all forms of injustices, and towards the indivisibility of justice. I'll stop.
Thank you for that. Such a tour de force, Professor Abdulhadi. Really powerful dissection of colonial imperialist feminism, and really you provided us a crucial genealogy of colonial imperialist feminism, as well as I really appreciate you bringing in questions of class and race and really drawing parallels with Black feminist socialist critiques of bourgeois feminism and the anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, pro-national liberation dimension of feminism as well. Yeah, so that was really powerful. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to pass the floor back to Essam. Thank you.
No, thank you, Rabab and Walaa, for your interventions. Here's what we usually do is that you can use the Q&A function to pose your questions. So obviously I have questions and Karina has tons of questions too that we can ask Rabab and Walaa, but we open the floor to anybody to just type their questions in the Q&A function and we'll get to them as soon as they come. But I kind of have a kind of relatively broad question to Walaa, particularly the notion of how feminism has been monopolized to mean one thing, which kind of serves the imperialist narrative. So, and you have pointed out the kind of the centrality of national liberation to feminism. So how has iterations of this notion of intersectionality, or particularly how has the iterations of intersectional imperialism blurs national liberation and feminism, particularly speaking about Palestine? And this is a little bit broad question, but I think it really ties to what you have spoken about.
Thank you, Essam, for the question. It's a good question, actually. Yeah, just to start from where Rabab left off, and which also ties in with your question about are we socialists or nationalists? And I think also Dr. and Comrade Adil Samara kind of touched on this in his class last week. You know, there is always this kind of conception that there's a contradiction between socialism and nationalism, and that we have to pick one or the other. And actually, speaking from the south of the world and the struggle, the history of the struggle for national liberation, I don't see them at odds at all. And I must point out actually to some good literature that I've managed to come across recently by pure chance, someone called Delia Aguilera. There's a good book, but also other essays. Actually, this is an article. It's called Toward a Reinscription of Nationalist Feminism, writing from the context of the Philippines. And kind of reconciling us, you know, because there is so much, especially within a Western imperial core context. And I dealt with this through my literature review when I was doing my PhD about, you know, how to, like, there is this idea that nationalism is bad. And so it ties in with imperialism or fascism. But, you know, that's very much coming from the positionality of those speaking from within the imperial core against fascist formation of nationalism. When it comes to the south of the world, I think, and this is where it becomes essential to read third world Marxists and many of whom we've had so far on this course, and understand the perspective that they bring forward in terms of how we align our nationalism with socialism. And in terms of your question about intersectionality, I think we've seen some of the troubling political manifestations when it comes to intersectionality, and in the way that it has kind of functioned and served very well within the context of bourgeois capitalism, in the sense that we see this in the neoliberal academy. You know, it's become about a checkbox of like how if you have a Black woman, queer, and so on, to kind of, again, be used to have this kind of branding image of how progressive these capitalist and essentially bourgeois institutions can become. And so it has accommodated, or it has been used in a way that is accommodating for capitalism rather than challenging it. And this has very much to do with the missing out the class component of the analysis, which as we know, Marxian analysis puts it at the forefront of our understanding of everything. And so historical materialism matters a lot. And this is where I appreciate some of the work of decolonial scholars. And I started my talk gesturing to the value of some of their work, although some of them, including Sylvia Wynter, have been antagonizing Marxist, Leninist, feminist. And so we do have these kind of internal clashes and contradictions, but I do find value in the kind of work they do in terms of historicizing how feminism essentially emerged from within the womb of settler, colonial, and imperial violence. And so maybe we do need to bring out different taxonomies and different concepts. I'm very much becoming ambivalent to the word feminism, if you want. And I'm much more, on the side of anti-imperial, anti-colonial struggle, as Khalid has put it forth for us. I've met a lot of queers who are very ambivalent about the very word queer. Does this serve? Is this even, does it even apply? Because again, this is a matter of historical abstraction. You're taking a concept and you are applying it to a historical context where you have a different subjectivity and you have different social relations. So I stand more on the ambivalence side when it comes to, even the very categories that we have to kind of uphold and use to organize. But this is very much work in process too, We are not just fixed in maybe in the past I've had different way of viewing things and but things develop, and also with this ongoing genocide, and it brings so much clarity as to what the struggle is about, I think. I hope I answered the question, Isam, and this wasn't just a very long tangent.
No, it was. Thank you. And I think Adel Samara, who was our speaker last week for class last week, has his hand raised. So I'm just going to take that opportunity if I just allow him quickly. Please, Adel, feel free to unmute yourself.
Is my voice clear to you now? Can I speak now? Okay. Yeah, yes. I have just little points, if you like. First of all, thanks to Rabab and to Walaa, because I know Rabab before Walaa. Yeah, the first point that when Rabab talked about that the Zionists considers us as human animals, I remember in 1998 when the Zionists were trying to find out who are the people who are ready to negotiate in the so-called Oslo, Accords. They invited me, or or commanded me to meet them. And once they said, look, you are economists, we'll bring to you economists from the Hebrew University. Now, when I, in the meeting with the professors from the Hebrew University, one of them said that, look, yes, you are intellectual, but because 50% of the Palestinians originally are Jews, they don't want to believe, that we are as Arabs or as Palestinians, as Arabs, not Jews. The intellectual Palestinian originally is a Jew. Now, the second point also, I remember that when 1967, when we were arrested, they never thought or imagined that there will be a woman with us in the organization. That's why during their Orientalist and anthropological mentality, we covered a lot of our comrades, female comrades. They believed us, that women never participate with men in the struggle, etc., etc. Now, for the points which Rabab said, you remind me, Rabab, of the very important point that I am always against, the people who are saying that all or most of the martyrs in Gaza are women and children, because the fighter is also a victim, because we are a resistance movement. We are not an army who occupy the land of another army. The other point also, I remember in my book about women, especially the feminization of women, I termed a term, I call it in Arabic, nas dhukuriya, which is females in the service of male. And this is applied not only in capitalist center or capitalist core. It is a matter of, you know, that women are in their position or top position in this regime or that regime. In fact, they are serving capitalism and also يعني patriarchy. Yeah, thank you. These are the points which I want to talk about.
Thank you, Adil. Appreciate it. Well, sorry, Rabab, please. Yeah, it seems like you have
مرحبا
something to say.
Adil, good to see you. Good to be with you in the same space. It's been a long time. Yeah, we've known each other for a very long time. But I think it's the points I don't want to quarrel with a lot of them, but I actually wanted to say, I want to say one point about what you said, Adil, and also go back to your question, Essam. For Adil, I think it's really the whole question of colonialism needs native informants, whether it is women or women. And so whenever we are defying the colonial imperial will, of course they're going to bring other people and say, see, they're authentic, they're Palestinian, they're women, they have credentials, and this is what they're saying. And this is exactly what's also being played today and has been played again and again and again. So I think that's something that is, and is in particular works when you're talking about quote unquote progressive movements. So feminism is supposed to be a progressive movement. So you really need to kind of bring people who basically demolish not only the notions of against all forms of repression, but also demolish the notion of collectivity. So they also promote them as individuals. So it's kind of like there isn't a movement. There is one woman here, one woman there. There isn't the whole thing kind of like in the right before Oslo, Hanan Ashrawi. Everybody talks about like, what about the thousands and millions of women who've been in prison, who've been in the street, who've been fighting, and then we have to actually go and struggle to find photos of women in 1935 carrying guns. And I think it's sort of like in itself actually a problematic notion, because we always feel that we have to document. And then we know that the whole documentation is also part of the colonial knowledge production. But we cannot, because of the balance of forces in the world, and because we are not the ones whose narrative is actually dominant, because there is hegemonic narrative that's much stronger and has much more resources and so on. We need to do that. So it's a very kind of like contradictory thing, the same way I was talking about the archive. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say, a couple of things about, if I may, about what you said, how you answered. I hate the term intersectionality. I'm going to say it again and again. I actually find it like, I don't find it sufficiently complex. I think things overlap and embed, and not everybody is on a axis, you know, kind of, whether either multidimensional or whatever. This is intersectionality. I'm also a bit cross with Kimberly Crenshaw, she's been speaking all over the world. She hasn't said a single word about what's going on in Palestine. Like, I mean, you know, why aren't you? And it's not that she doesn't know, she knows, because we've been in many, many places. We provided a lot of information and so on. But I do have a problem with the term itself. But I also wanted to say a couple of things about the whole question, like Cynthia Enloe and all of the second, let's say, quote unquote, people call them second wave feminism or socialist feminism, because Cynthia Enloe does talk about imperialism, does talk about bases like bananas, bases and beaches. She has the khaki and whatever and so on. I think one of the biggest problem with these comrades of ours, I would say, is that they are so homophobic, they are so orientalist, and they refuse to contemplate things happening in our societies that are happening. But by the way, they also miss the boat when they talk about communities of color, indigenous communities in the US and so on. So we're not exceptional. There is something that they are unable to actually contemplate the possibilities of all these factors playing in, not only in women's lives themselves, but in the way the structures are. So it's not, because people say it, women, you need to talk about it. No, it's not just about women. It's about the whole structure. That's also affects women. This is why I have a problem with essentialism, because then it zooms only on women. And then we only talk about women to the exception of everybody else. You know, not only men, everything. We don't talk about class. We don't talk about citizenship. We don't talk about where people live. We don't talk about food. We don't talk about anything else except women. So then we're all sisterhood, quote unquote, sisterhood, global sister, all of this, I think, the garbage. But the last thing I want to say is about nationalism. And I'm actually make a point of arguing that I do not believe that our movements are nationalist. I believe, I mean, there is nationalism according to the way that the academia, you know, the 200 years of defining nationalism in all the forms, including Nazism, including Franco's, Mussolini, all of this. I don't believe that our movements actually fit into those. And I agree with you, Walaa, about being anti-colonial. But I do not think the movements are only nationalist. The movements are very eclectic. And they pick and choose. It's actually a very big problem for our comrades who are very dogmatic and strict Marxists. They don't like this messiness that we bring in, and we talk about all that. There's not just, you cannot just talk about, you know, nationalism. There is all these things. And I mean, Lenin, I'm sorry, Lenin in Baku conference even spoke about it, but even kind of like Marxists do not even read all of Marxism to kind of say the roots from which we're drawing this. This is not what it is. So there is this dogmatic aspect of it, but I think also there is the whole question of Islamophobia, which also permeates a lot of Marxists today, a lot of leftist resistor movements and so on, who have a serious problem with what's happening in Gaza, because the movement is led by the Islamist group. But I mean, but the problem is that if you're studying Algeria, and you're talking about the Algerian resistance movement was also led by Islamists. It wasn't led by the Communist Party. Communist Party in Algeria did not really play a big role. Socialists did not play a big role. And this is why Fanon sometimes misses and thinks about everything is about Islam and everything is about the veil and everything about this and that. But there is all these movements that are very, very complex, that have multiple players in them and multiple components that I think are really important for those of us, not only for theoretical analysis, which is good and fine and so on, we're, you know, write and publish, but for the movements themselves. How are we going to grow in the movements? So if sectarianism and secular fundamentalism is going to continue permeating us, we're not going to be able to actually come together, and we are going to be subjected to divide and rule.
Thank you for that, Rabab. We do have another question. Let's see, from Bashar. Let's see, says, thank you so much for this. What do you think of, what do you think the Western politicians like Clinton, I guess Hillary Clinton, are doing in regards to the issue of gender violence when they weaponize it so openly for their interests? Are we witnessing a dangerous loss of meaning, a gradual emptying out of these notions? Also, how do you think the question of Islamophobia connects to gender? And I think that speaks to your last comments, Rabab. So maybe, and also considering time, maybe we can, Walaa, if you want to address this question, and then we'll go back to Rabab and we'll use this as our final. Okay, great, thanks.
Sorry, I was still thinking, because I'm always provoked by Rabab, and the discussion is so good. Thank you, Rabab, for all the points you raised. I think, like, what I'm thinking of, can I go back just a little bit to the discussion about nationalism and so on? I think, like, for me, it's more the framework of national liberation, especially, you know, when we are still undergoing a process of, you know, how do you say, shaking the shackles of US imperialism and what the Zionist entity is doing to the region. So especially from the point of view of the Arab region, to speak, you know, more precisely. But we also have, I think, what will be a very good episode in the coming weeks about the axis of resistance as well. And it touches a lot about what you're saying, Rabab, about the Islamic dimension, but also the national liberation struggle for the region as a whole. And I think it's not isolationist in the sense that in the way that has been written about nationalism, in that, like, you know, as it has been seen or it has developed historically in the Western core. And I think there is a hope for inventiveness of history from, you know, what the colonized and those who continue to combat US imperialism to emerge out of that. And we are exactly at this juncture right now. You know, Palestine is literally at the core of a wide historical and geopolitical change when it comes to moving from a US unipolar hegemony to a more rising possibilities for a multipolar order, with China as well being at the forefront of that. And yeah, I think there's a lot to say there. So I'll just stop here. And in terms of answering the question, yeah, I think I hinted to Hillary, and I had that in one of the slides. And again, there was at Columbia this huge conference about sexual violence in conflict zones. And this touches again on the Cynthia Enlow camp, you know, because I did interact with her writings when I was teaching at the LSE, and we had her also come and speak to students. And she seems to have also jumped from talking about, you know, capitalism and colonialism in Banana in her earlier work to now talking about the Me Too movement, for example. So yeah, there is a lot of problems there. And yeah, the Hillary Clinton cult, you know, it's just a cult serving empire. You know, when that guy came into the conference room and he shouted her name and he said, "You are a war criminal." I mean, that's pretty much how we feel about her. And obviously a lot of what this colonial or imperial feminism propagate is underlined by a deep sense of Islamophobia and hate for Arabs. So there is definitely a connection there. I'll leave the floor to Rabab if she wants to also connect any further.
I don't have much to add, but I want to start by saying that Hillary Clinton is a liar. So I think it's really just to kind of, she lies. I mean, isn't she the one who spread the whole thing about Viagra in Libya? I mean, it's just like anything that fits their purposes, they will use it. And there are enough people. This is, and some of us, you know, we attended that thing online, the Hillary thing. It's, I mean, when she talks about being a champion, first, let's just go back to her history, who she was and what she's done. You know, like big time feminist, and your husband cheats on you, and actually you stay with him and cover up. Sorry, like even by any measures of colonial white feminism doesn't really work. Okay, so that's one. Then you talk about when she ran against Barack Obama, the racism, the overt racism that she. I'm not defending Barack Obama and so on, but I mean, I have my own analysis of him, and I think he definitely made a lot of promises he didn't fulfill. But I think he would not have been able to fulfill them anyway because he's one person representing a system. So it doesn't matter. But he also surrounded himself by so many Zionists, and he was also a climber from his history and so on. But she was really racist. She was very racist and actually the way she dealt with them. When she was Secretary of State, she supported a lot of interventions in Iraq and everywhere else. She was very much supported. She's constantly says this is our national interest. And by the way, this was a point I wanted to say the Zionists use a lot, is that they frame it within our national interest. They don't only frame it as support for Israel or Zionism. They actually also say this hurts our national interest. So they are actually very familiar, are very conscious that there are interests, that there are joint interests. So when people think if we could just convince the US, how are you going to convince the US to abandon Israel? Why would they? They're actually focusing on Netanyahu now because it's very easy target because everybody hates Netanyahu. So, okay, so when Netanyahu goes, are they going to stop the massacre? Is Gallant going to stop the massacre? I mean, he's the one who's leading the military and so on. But Hillary Clinton has been
I think Rabab's audio is cutting off a bit. So maybe, and this is a good time to maybe, Karina, I believe we don't have any other questions from the audience. But you have one last question you want to pose, potentially, if we can just extend post 11 p.m. I know it's late, but maybe one last question to Rabab and Walaa from you, Corina, and then we can conclude the session.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Essam. And I mean, the question I was going to ask was connected to the one that was just posed, but specifically about the sort of mass rape charges and thinking about this sort of ideological work that that report, the Pramila Patten, that UN report, which wasn't really an investigation, in fact, but was just pure, really propaganda. I mean, this whole the New York Times report that has sort of been reproduced in different outlets, news outlets, but how the sort of ideological work of those claims and linking it up to the question around Islamophobia, the Orientalist, ideas of gender and gender relations in Palestine, and in particular, what Rabab was talking about, how Orientalism has framed, even on the left, people's understanding of Hamas. So that was sort of one part of the question. And then the other part was about the university as a kind of as a terrain of struggle, and both of you have spoken a lot about knowledge production. Of course, we know and you're doing a special issue on this, Walaa, on repression in higher education. So what is the to what extent can we actually have these struggles in the current context of the university? And you also mentioned the question of epistemology, so thinking about critical epistemologies, but also alternative forms of knowledge production, and how these take place within can we have really an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, feminist pedagogy and knowledge production within the university, the way that is currently structured. And thank you, Rabab, you just came back. I was just asking a question, two questions. One was about the kind of ideological work about the mass rape claims and linking it up to the questions of Islamophobia and Hamas, which you were talking about earlier. But also thinking about the university as a terrain of struggle, and in particular in the context of heightened repression, Zionist repression. So, to what extent can we really talk about an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist feminism, different forms of knowledge production, critical epistemologies in the current context?
Yeah.
And so I'll...
Go ahead. Do you want to go ahead first?
Go ahead, Rabab. It's fine.
Okay. So, okay. So the whole question of the mass rape and so on, we already know that it is actually not true. It's a claim. The reason that it is very attractive and it's very seductive thesis notion for the Hasbara, for the Zionist movement, for Israel, and for colonial allies in the US and elsewhere, is because it fits, it plays into the imaginary. It plays in the colonial Eurocentric imaginary that already assumes that Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian men and hold on a minute, I have, okay, now Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim men are inherently rapist, misogynist, excessively hatred of women. And this comes out from a very long history of Eurocentric construction of knowledge. This is not something new. I mean, if you go, people attend, like, let's say, ballet and opera and so on, always the villain is the Muslim, and then there is like somebody, all these Christian guys come in and they rescue the damsel in distress. I mean, how many layers that you can actually talk about racism and so on, and feminism, but this is always there. And there is also in a lot of history writing, there is I remember the reason actually we started the project Imperial Feminisms of colonized bodies after 9/11 2001 is because every single meeting we'd go to, every single meeting will people say, assume, like, of course, this is what it is. Even the whole analysis by multiple scholars, even of the hijackers, Muhammad Atta and everybody else. I mean, they even liken him to Timothy McVeigh, Michael Kimmel. a very respected scholar in Islamophobia studies the late Barbara Ehrenreich. And the book that Betsy Reed and what's her name, Kathy Bullitt, the editor of The Nation, did together. I mean, again and again and again, there is an assumption, and if actually you challenge it, your people gaslight you and look at you as if you are crazy because you're challenging and saying on what basis? Because this is the basis where they come from. So this is kind of like big part of it, and this is so it's already there. And I think with the academia, just I will say it very quickly. With the academia, in liberal universities, and even if you don't want to say neoliberal university administrations, I believe, and I would argue, and I would bet my life on it, is they will never, the ruling classes will never ever allow the 60s to happen again. That doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, because colonists always claim all sorts of things and then they get defeated. I mean, the US said that they're not going to, they're going to win in Vietnam and they got defeated. The French said in Algeria, they got defeated. So it's not inevitable, but they are very careful about rolling back everything. And I see it, for instance, at my university. The 68th strike was the longest strike by students who were so principled. They were anti-Zionists. They supported indigenous people. They linked up with the Black Panther Party, with all the liberation movements and so on. And there was a huge report, I think it's 168 pages, that I think it was Nilsson at that time commissioned to say, hey, what's the Black Panthers doing at this university? And why are the students complaining? And they're very obsessed with making sure that movements, and this is why today they are so bothered by what's happening in the streets, because what's going on is that people are making, it's not ungovernable yet, but they are challenging business as usual. They are refusing to accept the status quo. Everybody's saying there is a genocide. When there is a genocide going on, we're not going to stand by and watch it continue. We're going to make everything possible to stop it and block it. Of course, the powers that be are very powerful. But I think, so this is why also at the universities, I mean, it's outrageous that they claim that they support the First Amendment and the constitutional rights and so on, and they're violating them left and right. This is how different that is. By the way, Hitler never, ever said that he has a constitution. Nazism did not say that. These people claim that they have a constitution, they have rights and so on. And every single, for Columbia University president to actually ban Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, and then when they have another, now 4 students are being expelled. And this is Columbia University, private university, that doesn't really have to really worry a lot about the publicness, but that's happening everywhere. And there is what I would say it might be a conspiracy, but it's not a conspiracy. That for us, that's why I'm arguing it's fascism. I really believe we are in fascist times, and I really believe that if people do not wake, and I'm talking about our colleagues, the intellectuals, the thinkers, the critical writers, if people do not stand up and stop it, it's going to engulf everybody, whether Biden or Trump win in November, because every 4 years. So the fact that they're actually ignoring it, it's crazy. I mean, like, where are we going to produce knowledge? Of course, we can do in the streets and we can do in the prison and so on and so forth. But these are universities. That's what they are supposed to do. And I don't understand how people can stand by and not find it so outrageous to fight against it.
Thank you, Rabab. Yes,
Yeah.
Walaa.
Okay, so the rape claims, there was a very good piece in the Gray Zone published recently. I don't know if you guys came across it, and it basically details some, they are sharing some of leaked Israel lobby presentations in which this lobby presentations have been used to urge US politicians to use certain talking points in the way that they want to propagate the narrative around the war and so on, Israel versus Hamas. And a lot of that focused on the mass rape claims. So that tells us a lot. But also there are many places where you can go and check, you know, some good journalism from Electronic Intifada to also other, like the New York Times piece was basically debunked by its own, you know, by the New York Times itself. So that tells us a lot, you know, in terms of the weaponization of the rape, and you know, this whole visit that this UN representative have made. She also, in the questioning, when she was questioned by good journalists about, you know, the findings of the report, she said that there was no investigation. So that says it all, right? I mean, like, I made sure to have in the slides the references to Emmett Till and all of that history, because when we talk about, you know, the weight of these ideas, it's not just about Palestine, and it's not out of the blue, as also, you know, Rabab and Corina have said. You know, this is a wider history of you know, of class struggle, and so and also, you know, sits within the wider economy of waste making. You know, from the indigenous peoples of the Americas to the enslaved African Americans and so on. And it continues, you know, so it's not just like the property of like Orientalism in relation to Arabs, but also it's also important to situate Palestine within that wider history and struggle. You know, guns and ideas go together, you know, as Castro has once said. And so these ideas are very important in order to point the guns and to continue the wasting, the death infliction and killing that they are doing in Gaza. The second question about what was the second question? Yeah, the university. I'm very pessimistic about the university. And so even like in criticizing Butler's criticism of the Harvard group, I am thinking, you know, Harvard group, you know, so much hope, you know, for us coming from, you know, bourgeois elite institutions. So we have to keep that at hand. You know, I arrived at Columbia 1 year ago, and I remember I was going into the university and a lot of its staff was undergoing a strike because, you know, they were cutting down on their wages in the aftermath of COVID. And it was just horrific to see that. And so, you know, these are the bourgeois institutions, and their legacy is a colonial one. You know, I worked at the LSE, you know, its history is that of, you know, white folks doing a lot of like the racist, misogynistic, and that kind of, you know, the arguments against the Black body needing to, you know, some medical interventions. How do you say that? The term skipped me, scientific term.
Eugenics?
Eugenics, thank you so much. Eugenics. So, you know, that's the LSE history. And so, you know, all of these elite institutions, you know, again, you know, we are also complicit in a way to find ourselves caught in that, you know, cog of, you know, power knowledge. At the same time, we do what we can do. You know, I was canceled myself as well. And Rabab, you know, mentioned all the attacks and, you know, the trials that she keeps undergoing by, you know, waged against her by the Zionist lobby. And they're working very hard, and they get a pay, they get a salary to do what they do and to attack us. But, you know, we do the counter strikes. And so initiatives such as this, I hope that they create an outlet that is alternative for students to learn and come together also for political organizing, if, you know, if the possibilities arise throughout these conversations. You know, just go out in the street, although also that is not enough, you know, given the organize maybe political parties to bring it down, because you don't want to participate in the facade of a democracy in the imperial court, because they would like to say that we've got democracy and so we've got protests and we allow people to protest. So you got to outsmart them, yeah, and organize as much as possible.
Thank you, Walaa and Rabab. I think you both touched on a very important point, which is the difference between freedom of speech and the obligation of speaking the truth, or the Greek term parrhesia. And this is what a lot of academics or people who sit in universities are afraid to do nowadays, which is that they have the freedom of speaking and they get to choose, should I speak or not, because they have the freedom. But parrhesia tells you that you should always speak, regardless of the consequences that you might have for speaking, because this is when it becomes important. When you don't have the right to speak, you have to ask the question why. And then that's when you start tackling the material question of like, why does this kind of the policing, the surveillance, and all of those things exist to silence those people who are actually speaking truth against power. So thank you both so much. And I know that we've passed, like, now it's been 2 hours and 15 minutes. And for those who are residing Palestine or Libya, it's 11:15. But I just want to share very quickly the schedule for these coming days, or the remaining 4 weeks or so of the course. So yes, it is 8 weeks course, and we just finished 4, and we thank all the speakers and the lecturers and so forth. So in a couple of days, it will be Eid al-Fitr. So Eid Mubarak to all those who celebrate, and Ramadan Mubarak. I hope you have blessed days and meaningful, joyful celebrations. We will come back on the 13th and the 14th. So it's going to be 2 sessions back to back: history of the Palestinian Revolution, and then it's going to be Palestine, Syria, and the question for anti-imperialism. A week after that, we're going to have axis of resistance and multipolarity, wars of national liberation, Palestine and global South, and then we're going to end with Palestine in the 21st century. So please keep following our social media and also our YouTube channel. And then all those who attended the session today, they will get access, they will get an invitation email to all these upcoming sessions. So thank you so much from all of us from Middle East Critique, and I hope you have a good rest of your day, your night, and blessed Ramadan to everybody. Take care. Bye.